Okay, we're live. This is about 4:30, and we're doing discussion on video number 20. I'm going to finish up the neurology terms out of the 50 that I gave you, and then tomorrow at 9:30, 12 on the right. And as I call out the question, I'll call it out twice and give you plenty of time for you to write down your answer. Um, and when we finish the exam after 50 vocabulary terms, then at the ending, I will post it. It'll be on YouTube, and you'll have 1 hour to send that back to me on my email, susancangel@comcast.net. I do want to see 2 rows. And when you answer one question, skip a line or two, and then number 2, then skip a line or 2, and then number 3 on the email that you do send me. So please do that. I'll go slow enough so that if you know the answer, you'll be able to get it. Also, if you don't know the answer and you want to jot it down, you'll have your piece of paper and you can jot down the question, and then at the very end, go back if you remember it and put it in. I will give you an hour to get those into me, and I think that'll be plenty of time. So let's begin number 1, and I'm just going to review with you, and I want you to depend on your memory and the videos that we've had and the textbook and the diagrams. Cerebellum, that was called the hindbrain, and it's separated from the occipital lobe by a transverse fissure. The hindbrain has 2 lobes, and it's connected in the center by the vermis. That hindbrain, known as the cerebellum, has sulci and gyri. They're just linear instead of convoluted, like the cortices of the brain. The cerebellum is responsible for smooth muscular movements. It's also responsible for balance, helping to maintain that balance in those smooth movements. And it's also responsible for maintaining muscle tone. So it is significantly smaller than the cerebral cortex, but yet very, very important. And its major responsibilities are autonomic, of a will unto themselves, maintaining that balance, having smooth muscular movements, and maintaining the muscle tone. And remember, when you're asleep, even that muscle tone is maintained because the cerebellum is sending messages to those skeletal striated muscles to contract in rotation. Some of the fibers are contracting in rotation so that you maintain that muscle tone. Meninges, that's a reference to the membranes around the brain. The outside membrane was the dura mater. It's extremely sturdy and puncture proof. It's a heavy, white, durable membrane. That's why they call it the hard mother. The membrane, the second membrane going in towards the cortices, is the arachnoid membrane, and it's thinner. It does have fibers that hang down that look cobweb-like and attached to the pia mater. In the arachnoid membrane, between the arachnoid membrane, which hugs the dura mater, and the pia mater, where those gossamer cobweb-like fibers exist, that's where the cerebral spinal fluid flows. Now, the membrane that actually hugs the gyri and the sulci of the cerebral cortex, that membrane is the pia mater, known as the soft mother. It is riddled full of capillaries, and these capillaries, remember, by the end of the first year of life, these capillaries taking care of the nervous tissue in the brain have the blood-brain barrier. The cell membrane of those capillaries is tight enough that some amino acids and even toxins that could get through the capillary and actually reach the nervous tissue does not, because it could cause seizures or convulsions. So you have that blood-brain barrier. It's not only helped by the wall of the capillary, the membrane of the capillary, but also the astrocytes, which are the neuroglia that wrap around those capillaries to help maintain that blood-brain barrier. Also, if you look at the ventricles, the first and second, third, and fourth ventricle, you'll see lining those ventricles is the pia mater, and in some areas of the pia mater, there's a high or dense concentration of capillaries that we call the choroid plexus, and that choroid plexus contains the ependymal cells, which pull from the plasma the cerebral spinal fluid, and that choroid plexus, which is part of the pia mater, secretes it into the ventricles, the first and second, the fourth, and the third, first, second, third, and fourth as it flows. Okay, in telling you that, I just explained that blood-brain barrier. If you're a little confused, go back into your notes and go back into the textbook. The blood-brain barrier is comprised of those tight membranes in the capillary as well as the astrocytes that help that blood-brain barrier. It is important. Transverse section over the spinal cord. If you do a transverse section through the spinal cord, in that transverse section, you'll see the outer portion of the spinal cord is white because those are heavily myelinated tracts. Now remember, if you have a bunch of axons in the CNS, that is the central nervous system, those bundles of axons are heavily myelinated and they're called tracts. Some of these tracts ascend, carrying messages from the body to the spinal cord and up to the brain. Some descend. The tracks only go in one direction, and the outside of that cord is white. It's just the opposite as the outside of the brain. The outside of the brain, if you remember correctly, is gray, and it's gray because you don't have axons that are heavily myelinated on the outside of the brain. You just have cell bodies and dendrites, which are gray in color. But it's just the reverse in the spinal cord. The outside is white, heavily myelinated. And then in the transverse section, you see the outer area is white. In the center, it's gray. The gray appearance looks like the shape of an X or a butterfly as you ascend and descend. And the outer wings, the top of that butterfly, are referred to as the dorsal horns. The ones lower towards the anterior section of that spinal cord, those are the ventral horns. And then in the central is the central canal. The central region of that transverse section of the spinal cord is gray because you have bunches of cell bodies and dendrites that are not myelinated, and these bunches are referred to as nuclei. In the peripheral nervous system, they're called ganglia, but they're referred to as nuclei in the central nervous system. So that butterfly-shaped area, that's important because that's where the accommodation for the reflex arc occurs, and then in the center of that butterfly-shaped structure is the central canal through which cerebral spinal fluid flows. And remember, on the outside of the spinal cord, just like the outside of the brain, there is the dura mater, and then going in again is the arachnoid, and going further in is the pia mater. So it's dura mater, arachnoid and pia major. You have those meninges which comprise the outside of the spinal cord, just like they comprise the outside of the brain. Okay, reflex arc. Now, if you remember correctly, the reflex arc is a reference to reflexes, and a reflex is an unpremeditated response to a given stimulus. So you touch a hot stove, you pull your hand away because the sensory afferent neurons in your hands carry the message by sensory afferent neurons to the spinal cord. It enters the back door of the spinal cord in the dorsal horn and then passes to the ventral horn. It exits by the anterior or ventral portion of the spinal cord and by motor neurons, motor, to the muscles of the arm. They're stimulated by these motor neurons efferently going away from the cord to pull the arm away from the hot stove. Then, after the reflex arc has occurred, that autonomic response to a given stimulus, then the tracts of the white portion of the spinal cord, they ascend and take the message up the spinal cord to the medulla oblongata, the pons, the midbrain, up through the thalamus, and the thalamus directs it to the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe, so you have cognition or awareness of what you just experienced. So that is the reflex arc. The carotids, that's just a reference to the blood vessels that carry oxygenated blood from the aortic arch to the brain. And the carotids come up on the right and left side of the neck. It's a pretty strong and thicker artery right about here. It bifurcates into the external carotid to feed the outside of the brain. Once that carotid breaks down to arterioles and capillaries, that's where the exchange is made by the external carotid, and then the internal carotid, just about an inch towards the center of the brain. Then that internal carotid breaks down to smaller arteries, arterioles, and then capillaries, and feeds the brain directly. Remember, these capillaries coming off that external and internal carotid, those capillaries, they're so constructed that there is, again, the blood-brain barrier. The center of the brain is fed by the transverse foramina from the cervical vertebra that enter at the base of the brain, come up through the middle of the brain, and feed the central portions of the brain. Okay, the sympathetic chain. The sympathetic chain is a reference to a line of ganglia. And you know, ganglia are just bunches of cell bodies. They're the sympathetic chain. They're also called the paravertebral chain of ganglia or the lateral chain of ganglia. Again, they're on the outside of the dorsal root ganglion. They're not the dorsal root ganglion. They're a different linear listing of ganglia called the sympathetic chain. They're called the sympathetic chain because they're activated in the thoracolumbar region of your spinal cord. They come off of that and they put you into that sympathetic response. And I'll answer that sympathetic response right now. It's the last vocabulary term. The sympathetic response found in these sympathetic chain ganglia will send the message to collateral ganglia. There's just a few of those, and then they'll hit parts of the body that put you in the sympathetic response. In the sympathetic response, again, your pupils will dilate, the respirations will increase, your heartbeat will increase its rapidity in strokes so that it pumps more blood every minute throughout the body. The blood vessels will narrow to speed up your blood pressure, your digestive tract, your GI tract slows down because you don't need to be digesting your food when you're in a crisis, running from a mugger or a saber-toothed tiger. So the GI tract slows down, and so does elimination. Okay, and so does the reproductive tract. So everything you need for the sympathetic response speeds up. What you don't need in that sympathetic response slows down. Okay, and then when the crisis is over, the parasympathetic response in the craniosacral region of your spinal cord takes over, and everything that was sped up or slowed down in the sympathetic response is reversed in that parasympathetic response. The terminal ganglia are part of the parasympathetic response. And the terminal ganglia, they're not paravertebral or lateral on the outside of the spinal cord. You find the terminal ganglia all the way to the organs that they service. They will be ganglia just outside the organ or just within that organ. So what these terminal ganglia do is cause the pupils to constrict, the respirations to slow way down. The salivary glands, which are part of the GI tract, will speed up and you'll release the saliva. The heart itself will slow down to its normal 72 to 60 strokes or beats per minute. The blood pressure will come down. You don't need that rapid blood pressure when you're in the relaxed mode, because you're going into that relaxed mode. Your GI tract speeds up and you can digest your food, and elimination then speeds up so you can eliminate too. And the reproductive tract will speed up because you are sexually aroused in the parasympathetic mode, not the sympathetic mode. It's in the relaxed mode. So the parasympathetics involved rest and digest, and they involve those terminal ganglia going all the way to the organ or just inside the organ, and they're coming off that craniosacral region. That's the reason if someone's real uptight and tense, if they get a neck rub, back of their neck, that they feel wonderful on that because it starts to put them into that parasympathetic mode. Okay, and the sympathetic response I just mentioned. So know the difference between the parasympathetic responses and what the body does and the sympathetic responses. Okay, that gives us about 18 minutes on these last terms. So please study these terms tonight diligently and tune in at 9:30 in the morning. I will hopefully put these on YouTube. I'll end this stream and put these on YouTube at 9:30, and I'll give you plenty of time when I ask each question to put down that answer. I'll repeat that question slowly, making sure you know. I'll give you lots of hints. And when I'm finished, then you can go online. It'll be listed as Neuro 21, final exam, Susan Angel. And good luck. I'll be home tonight. So if you have any questions, please call me. I thank you so much for staying with me through all these hours. I really appreciate it. I wish I'd been with you. I like to teach students that are in front of me, and I can see your beautiful faces, and I get a bounce back or a volley or response. Any questions, don't hesitate to call 761-3636. And again, I sure miss you guys, and I wish I was with you in person to give that final. And thanks so much for staying with me. See you tomorrow.